Thank you so much for coming on this homecoming weekend. I really appreciate it and hope you get a new perspective on the exhibition upstairs. In keeping with Indigenous protocols from Australia, I'd firstly like to acknowledge the customary owners of the land we're standing on, and pay my respects to their ancestors, both past and present. This exhibition is called Crossing Cultures, and I think it's really important for us to model the protocols involved in cultural border crossings and register the history of the land, which is one of the most important themes that is running through the exhibition upstairs. For Aboriginal people from Australia, the land has always been the literal and symbolic bedrock of cultural knowledge. The shape-shifting ancestors who created the land, named it, passed down the laws of social behaviour on these epic journeys, eventually metamorphosed into the land and vested it with their power. These narratives are often called dreamings, and they are reconstituted during ceremonial performances and cultural art production to ensure the well-being of the ancestors, their sites of residence, and the people who are forever connected to them. Within these portraits of country, which is a colloquialism of Australian or Aboriginal English, meaning culturally inherited tracts of land, are incredible systems of knowledge that have contributed to the physical and spiritual survival of Aboriginal people for over 50,000 years. However, since the colonisation of Australia in 1788, this knowledge has become largely devalorised by people who chose not to learn its cultural signification or sophistication. It was not until 1971-72 when senior men began painting at a community called Papania, using an iconography that had never been seen by outside, non-initiated audience. And so at this moment, Aboriginal culture began to be seen extensively as having both artistic and intellectual value. Art has provided the crucial public platform with which Aboriginal people can make legible certain aspects of their cultural inheritance and demonstrate that we need to see ourselves as not distinct from the natural world, but part of it. This exhibition celebrates the gifting of a significant collection of Aboriginal art from two American donors, Owen and Harvey Wagner, who in 2009 and 2011 gifted over 500 works, Aboriginal works, from their collection to Dartmouth. They don't actually have a connection to Dartmouth, but they did loan some works to an exhibition we had in 2006 called Dreaming Their Way. And what they were really impressed with, the strong teaching focus of the Hood Museum of Art. And when they were thinking of where they should place their collection, they thought of the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth. What we're looking at the moment is a map of Aboriginal Australia. So listing the 250 to 500 languages, depending on your definition of a language or a dialect, of Aboriginal Australia. So this is what Captain Cook would have seen at when he arrived in 1788. And when he took claim to the continent of Australia, he said that the land was terra nullius, the land belonging to no one. And what's important about this map is that it demonstrates, the extensiveness of Aboriginal occupation over the continent. So, when he arrived in 1788 in the southwest, he laid claim to it, and refused to kind of see, the sophistication of Aboriginal art production. When I was thinking about this exhibition, I was reading a book called The Wayfinders, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in the Modern World. And I was thinking about, how I should position the works in this exhibition. And, I wanted to read out the quote because it kind of gave some clarity to me when I was thinking about this show. And the quote is, "Imagine for a moment if all the genius and intellect of all generations that have come before you have been concentrated on a single set of tracks, focused exclusively on knowing a particular piece of ground, not only plants and animals, but every ecological, climatic, geographic detail, the pulse of every sentient creature, the rhythm of every breath of wind, the patterns of every season. This was the norm in Aboriginal Australia." And while I kind of got caught up in the drama and romance of this quote, the more I spent time with the works in this collection, I realised, how much they embody this really important systems of knowledge that kind of relate to the seasons, the weather, philosophical as well as psychological knowledge, and these things, what I wanted to bring out in this exhibition. So this is a map of Australia superimposed over a map of the United States without Alaska and Hawaii. And just to give you a sense of the scale of Australia. So from coast to coast, it's approximately the same distances. And although we have only a population of 23 million people. This map shows some of the major deserts in Australia, and deserts cover about 20%, nearly 20% of the continent of Australia. And lots of the works that we're looking at in this exhibition relate to some of these deserts. And within these deserts, they have very different ecosystems, and Aboriginal people have come up with different ways of relating to the land, knowing how to engage with it. This is an image of the central desert, and I wanted to, for me, it doesn't symbolize a desolate place, something that is devoid of life and vitality. And when you look at the images upstairs, you'll also see how alive this landscape is, and how Aboriginal people have survived within this often quite extreme landscape. It's not a kind of a Sahara, it's not unending sand dunes. There is vegetation, and Aboriginal people in the paintings that Aboriginal people make, they talk about waterholes, they talk about living off the land, and this very close association with the landscape. So in 1971-72, an art teacher named Jeffrey Barden encouraged some children to start painting, start drawing their own designs. And the senior men in the community of Papania said that they weren't, they didn't have the seniority to kind of depict these designs. And so the senior men did a very important honey ant mural in the Papania settlement. And this was a translation of ground designs that are made by communities. So they're low relief kind of sculptures made of plant fibres, sometimes rocks, and often have these vertical poles. And so when you're looking at the paintings upstairs, you'll realise that they're kind of a representation of some of this iconography, some of these collaborative ground paintings. This was a collaborative work that was over 40 feet long in an exhibition in Paris. And in collaboration with the Richard Long Mud Circle. And so this is one of the first works that you encounter upstairs. And Ronnie Jumper was, one of the founding members of the Papania Western Desert Painting School. He was a young man at the time, and he's still alive. And he's depicting what is known as the Tingery design. So these concentric circles that have a very hypnotic quality, and the radiating lines. And this design shows the journey of the Tingery men through the desert. And this painting, Fire Dreaming at Mamunya, depicts the great fire that overtook the landscape. And it's a depiction of Lake Mackay, which Pintupi people call Wilkin Carra, which is the second largest lake in Australia, but it's a salt lake. So this incredible 60-mile long salt lake. And it has, this beautiful, almost kind of ethereal quality to it. And you can imagine experiencing this site, at certain times of the day when the light, under the light of the sun, under the light of the moon, with campfire, how incredibly inspiring this landscape would be, especially for young initiates who would have ceremonies adjacent to this site. But also, you can see in this contraction and expansion of that site, Wilkin Carra, kind of opening up this ancestral realm, but also suggestive of the flickering flames of fire. And so, when the Tingari men were walking through the desert landscape, they passed on the knowledge of using fire for kind of regeneration of the landscape. So, within this painting, you're looking at something that depicts the creation of the land, depicts initiation ceremonies, but also depicts a kind of ecological understanding of the land. So this is an aerial view of Wilkin Carra. So it's very extensive, and it kind of cuts the border of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. So these are some of the designs that people still paint onto their bodies in preparation for ceremonies. And so, many of the paintings are a representation, a kind of translation of some of that imagery. This is another one of the first works that you encounter upstairs in the exhibition, and is by an artist, Ninga Naparula. And she was married to one of the founding artists, Yala Yala Gibbs Jungarai. And, she assisted him with the paintings, but it wasn't really until the late 1990s that women were encouraged and credited as being artists in their own right. This work references a women's birthing site, so a site associated with women. And, you can see in these kind of curvilinear designs the suggestion of kind of swollen bellies of pregnant women, this idea of a community, women helping other women. And in the solid red designs, you also have these bush foods that women know how to kind of harvest. The work is also referencing these sand drawings, made in the sand with 2 or 3 fingers. And when people are doing these designs, they're kind of narrating sequences from the dreaming. And sometimes, if someone who is not entitled to look at these designs, if it's a women's ceremonial site and, a man comes along, sometimes they'll, rub out the imagery so not to kind of offend the man, and, not to share the knowledge that is, is gendered knowledge. So, while these designs are kind of hollowing out the landscape, the works on canvas are really kind of building up the surface, much like the ground designs. So this is another classic example of the Tingari design by, quite a senior artist. And, what I love about this work is the kind of intense heat that radiates from this painting. And lots of the works from Papania really have a very sensorial kind of effect. And they're talking about, they kind of depict the heat and the sensations of rising heat in the landscape. This is a work by George Drungarai, a very kind of optical work, and very sophisticated, clever painting. And when you go up close upstairs, you'll see how three-dimensional the work is, and it kind of plays with these hairpin turns, and almost looks like a fingerprint or something, but it's referencing a snake dreaming site. So in these meandering lines, you have the trace left behind in the desert sands by a snake. And these designs, are not, nothing comes from nothing. They're kind of referencing these sacred designs that are incised onto objects. Shields, stone objects, as well as these pearl shells, which are traded from the coastal areas, on the Western Australia, right into the inland, and they have, they're highly prized by desert people. This is an incredible work by an artist called Angelina, Pola, and I'll just show you a detail because it's a really incredibly sophisticated work. It is really a study in, pointillism, and I actually have a small video that I wanted to play showing her paintings, some of these works.
Ingarakulan malpum langar wala kan modnam. Pele kan modnam. Langar wala modnam marakurin yang waran langar. Ngayon naman mata ka kan ngayon naman kuman mata la kumanan. Ano ko diyan mal ko diyan naman ko la naman. Kuman an ko la naman. Manan. Ano ko diyan ni ko. Put plam yan yan. Put plam abra krinon dan ikilaj bagalagin. Manir puler kuan man. Lejan man. Lej krinon. Lato nang pulan man. Ano ko diyan ni. Al kuman man langar walan man nam langar alan. Kamalan man aranin langar walan malan aranin man kamalan. Langar walan. Iya langar walan.
And so one of the first things you'll notice is obviously that the artist is painting on the ground, and this is something that lots of Aboriginal artists like to do, and it's as if the kind of imagery is being conjured up from the ground, and people can move around while they're painting. You see, she can actually sit on the painting, while she's laying down the several different layers of paint, and this. And sometimes that reveals some interesting kind of distortions in perspective and some interesting distortions in scale. But often Aboriginal people exaggerate places that are significant to them. And so while we can read these as maps, they're not they're not Google Maps. They're not they're more like metaphysical maps, and show their relationship to the land in this kind of proportionate way. So this work is actually referencing the gradual ripening of the bush plum, and so it starts off as this greeny grey colour, and then as it ripens it kind of takes on this deep burgundy purple colour. And this is how Aboriginal people know that the bush plant is ripe for eating. The white dots that you can kind of make out in the work is actually referencing Aboriginal women, because this plant needs to be germinated by the wind. It needs to be germinated by other animals, by fire. It can't self-germinate. So Aboriginal women have to scatter some of the seeds of this bush plant to ensure, the continuation of this kind of source of bush food. And so this is, an image of the kind of bush plum. This is an incredible work by an artist from Yuendamu. So after, from Papania, they started to paint in the 1970s, but it wasn't until, at least a decade later that artists from Yuendamu, decided to paint for the public. And they had lots of community conversations. The men gifted the dots to women so that they could use that in some of their iconography. And so the story upstairs is, how Aboriginal art, as we now know it, kind of crossed cultures as well, and kind of spiraled out from Papania into these other desert communities. So in Yuendamu, when they started to paint in the early 1980s, they were known for these, very bold, very kind of graphic images that encoded sacred stories about the land. This work references, it's called Nyapa Jukupa Puyuru, Water Dreaming at Puyuru. And so obviously we know that one of the most important things about living in the desert is knowing, where to find reliable sources of water. So, this work references the journey of two ancestral men who moved through the landscape, shaped the landscape, sang down the songs, gave the correct modes of behaviour for people, and, showed people how to live, interact with this landscape. And so what you're looking at in this painting is the transformation of, the dry, dusty riverbeds as they're transformed into these kind of fast-flowing rivers. And you can see, if I can just point, these parallel bars and all the dotting kind of signify, the clapping of thunder, the bolts of lightning, and the precipitation that's coming down. But the interesting thing about this painting is that the men sang down the rain, so they had the power to summon down the rain give the land its fertility. And so, I've actually seen the artist do his own rain-making a song, and it was quite incredible. And when he did this at the opening of the Kintore painting studio, and about 5 hours west of Alice Springs. And when I drove back to Alice Springs, the Todd River, which is never in flood, was in flood. So, I kind of believe in his kind of own power, and don't trust the teller, trust the tale. This is a work by Elizabeth Numi Nungarai. She's from the Balgo community, which was an old mission station, and she is referencing, in the earlier picture I showed you, the desert, with those clusters of spinifex grasses that grow kind of in this circular formation. And, sometimes this spinifex plant is the white that is covering most of the painting. And some of these, you can use the spinifex as a resin, it's used as an adhesive onto cultural artifacts. And so you see in this image these U-shapes, and they're referencing the trace left behind in the desert. So they symbolize people sitting on the ground. Often, when you see this imagery, it's kind of a euphemism for something important happened. Perhaps a ceremony took place, or perhaps it's a more secular scene of just people, gathered together. You can also see this kind of figurative depiction of a coolerman, this kind of a shallow carrying dish, and also these sticks, which are kind of used for digging yams and digging other bush foods in the desert. But some of these bush foods have important medicinal qualities, have important kind of curative qualities, and Aboriginal people know how to kind of use these bush foods for things like headaches and infections and all kinds of things. But one of the when I've gone on these kind of expeditions with people, some of the it's really this kind of animating all of the senses, kind of touch and taste and smell. And I think this picture, with its kind of highly candy-coloured nature, really speaks to the abundance of the desert landscape. This is one of my favourites. I know curators shouldn't really have favourites, but it was the work that we got to be on the cover of the catalogue, and it's referencing an artist who I was very fond of, and she is from a community. She was painting at a community called Bijadanga, but she's a Yulparija woman, which means she was originally from the desert. And so in the 1960s, the desert became used for industrial mining, and there was also a cyclical drought. And so people could no longer use these water holes that they'd survived on for close to 50,000 years. And so there was an exodus from the desert. And this work references that exodus by the artist. And two of her mother and her sister actually died on this journey out from the desert. And she said that she would never return to this place. It's called Pinkalata, this water hole where there was always, abundant source. Well, before they left, there was always this source of living water. And she eventually returned to this place, and there's quite a beautiful film, a short 30-minute film about the return to this place. But what I really enjoy about this work is that, she's using the paint. She's been inspired by living on this coastal community. There's these beautiful kind of turquoise blues, and she's painting Pinkalada, not how it is, but how she remembers it, at this place of kind of, lush abundance, kind of fertility. And so, it's looking, at this history of Western Australia, and how it is still a place that is quite, used, is kind of a site for lots of mining exploration at the moment. And, how these extractive industries don't actually give back to the places that they're exploring. This is so now we're moving away from the desert and moving into what has been called urban-based artists. And this is a work by an artist, Christian Thompson, and he's originally from Queensland, but he was born in Adelaide, but his father was in the army, so he moved around quite a lot. And you get a sense of this kind of dislocation in this kind of beautiful bouquet of cut flowers. He created this work in 2007, before a federal election, and there was lots of before something called the intervention happened in Australia, which was where the federal government sent sent troops into Aboriginal communities, and it was a way to ostensibly protect Aboriginal women from Aboriginal men. And so, in the media, this image of Aboriginal men as kind of criminals was really played out and hammered home. And the artist was kind of reacting against that. So you have this depiction of the hoodie, with its associations of criminality. But it also has this beautiful kind of, some people see it as kind of a surreal primal scream. Others see it as kind of a very peaceful, gentle image. And I'm kind of a mixture of the two. But he's referencing the Commonwealth Flora and Fauna Act. Before, Aboriginal people weren't counted as part of the census, they were part of the flora and fauna. So the artist is playing with this kind of double-hinged meaning of, Australian native, Australian native flowers and Australian native people. And, while this definition and while this kind of association has been quite punishing for Aboriginal people, if they were seen as to be animals, they were also seen to be pests. But the artist is kind of reclaiming this association and saying that Aboriginal people do have this very strong association to the land, particularly in places where they've been, dispossessed from, particularly in urban areas, which is not the absence of landscape. So the artist is kind of dealing with a lot of complex issues, but if you've ever been to Australia, you'll notice that some of this, the kind of kangaroo, the emu, lots of the native flowers, are seen on the currency, they're seen on the coat of arms. They've become these symbols of they've become colonial symbols, and the artist is really refusing to be part of that kind of colonial history. This is a work created in 2001, 4 years after the Bringing Them Home report, which was a really important report that was tabled in the Australian Parliament to kind of to talk about something that hadn't really been spoken about before, and that was the stolen generation. So people who were deliberately taken away from their families, taken away from their parents, as a kind of a experiment in assimilation. You'll have to get quite up close to this work upstairs, but you'll see that the artist has actually photographed himself over this long exposure time, and his legs have become kind of translucent. So he becomes this ghostly figure in the landscape. And on one level, he's talking about this very strong idea that Aboriginal people have about walking in the footsteps of the ancestors, but also about kind of puncturing through the invisibility of Aboriginal people, particularly in urban areas, even though the majority of Aboriginal people actually live in urban areas. And so we have this interesting juxtaposition between the tyranny of the built environment. We have these signs against these beautiful monumental gum trees, and in Australia, in America you have this. Can't you see this sign, which here is the yield sign, and in Australia it's called Give Way. And the artist is really kind of asking Australians to kind of yield, to kind of give way to some of the narrative, really the foundational narrative of Australia. And he's at this crossroads, and in 2001, we too, Australia was at a kind of a crossroads and doing lots of soul searching about, how we want to present ourselves as a nation, what we choose to remember and what we force people to forget. So this work for me kind of talks about that historical amnesia and trying to puncture through it. And when you go upstairs, well, hopefully some of you will go upstairs, the work is really highly reflective, and so the viewer becomes implicated within this narrative, and you kind of have to decide whether you see the Aboriginal figure kind of emerging or receding. I wanted to move a little bit quickly, and now we're going to a community called Lockhart River in far north Queensland, and it's on the eastern cape of Cape York Peninsula, so the very pointy bit of Australia. And at this community, instead of the art being championed and started by senior people, the art movement really began with young adults and adolescents. And it was an after-school program, and people would kind of use this opportunity to be very exploratory with technique and media, and very experimental. And that kind of that agenda of creativity has really remained with the Lockhart River community, which is has been plagued with lots of kind of social dysfunctional issues, including truancy, high unemployment, and alcoholism. This work is referencing the artist visiting the beach, and it's kind of her positioning herself on the shoreline, but you can also read it as an aerial perspective as well. And I love these kind of oppositional elements of the very fiery red that almost look like kind of lava exploding or something, but also these very deep, cool, kind of saturated blue colours as well. And the artist has a very interesting technique. She wets the entire canvas and then throws the paint onto the canvas, and sometimes sweeps it into place with a broom, and then she puts this almost kind of a shellac over it, and it really freezes some of those drying pools of pigment on the canvas and gives the work this great immediacy. And when I taught a course in the winter, this was one of the most popular images that the students responded to. And it is talking about community, the good and the bad, the heat and the coolness, and it's a very sophisticated work by a young artist, kind of using paint, using the painting process as a kind of a form of catharsis. So a number of communities, from what you've seen so far, has been communities who've been using acrylic paints. And there are 4, and lots of communities decided that they wanted to separate their painting practice from the ceremonial domain. So they wanted to separate their practice from the ceremonial. But there are a number of communities who still use ochres for painting for the public, and I'll go through a few of them now. This is a work by a younger artist, Craig Kumida, who's from Arakoon, which is on the West Cape of the Cape York Peninsula. And this work, references one of, the great icons of Australia, the crocodile. But it's the freshwater crocodile. And the Wik people believe that the story is about the freshwater crocodile. He had a wife who decided that she wanted to go with the saltwater crocodile. And that made the freshwater crocodile very upset. So he decided to kind of wage a battle against the saltwater crocodile, and he attacked him, and the saltwater obviously attacked him back. And the saltwater crocodile bit him on the tail and bit him on the nose, which is why the freshwater crocodile has a smaller tail and a kind of a narrower snout. And so obviously in these stories that talk about the creation of the kind of animal kingdom, they're also talking about the correct models of behaviour for people. So, in these transgressive stories, you learn about what not to do. So you don't go after another man's wife. Oh yes, well, wife doesn't go after the man. And so this is, beautifully carved. Originally, these were kind of modelled in clay, and often they had very articulated joints, and they're used in ceremonial performances. So they would become part of these ceremonies. So another community that uses ochres is the Tiwi Islands, and this is really the foundational narrative from the Tiwi Islands, which also talks about a transgressive relationship. So this is the image of Prukapali, and this is his wife Bhima, and this is his brother Tapara. And Bhima and Tapara were having an affair, and they went out into the bush one day, and she, to go and make love, and she left her son, called Janani, under the shade of these kind of trees. And they were gone quite a while, and the area in the shade moved. And so the little infant was exposed to the intense heat of the sun, and he suffered heat exhaustion and heat stroke, and he passed away. And before this, death didn't come to the Tiwi Islands. But from that moment, death would have to come to the Tiwi Islands, and then they performed the first Pukamani ceremony, the first kind of final farewell for people. And so in the final image, you see Prukapali cradling his infant son, and he will parcel him in paper bark and then walk into the ocean. And Tiwi people believe that at low tide you can see the footprints of Prukapali, and there is this kind of whirlpool where he kind of emerged into the went down under the earth. And these carved objects called tutini are commissioned by the artists, by the deceased's, by the deceased family. And sometimes they're quite well-known artists. And this ceremony usually takes place about a year after somebody passes away. And it's a way to give people enough time to kind of have the grief kind of yield to some kind of relief. And in the ceremony, these bark baskets, these kind of lashed string baskets, are placed on the top of these tutini, and these baskets are used for to collect food and water, and it's a way to symbolize that the person no longer feeds or eats anymore. And part of the process of these works is that they eventually kind of return to the earth. So there's kind of they become part of the elements of nature. And this is a depiction of some of the feathered armbands and headdresses that people wear for this ceremony. So it's a very kind of percussive, very kind of energetic dance, and it's as if the people are getting rid of the grief from their bodies. And something that's very interesting from the Tiwi Islands is they use this thing called a comb, this proja, and it's the same word for bone. And so you can see in some of this imagery, very kind of immaculately reproduced designs. And it's because they're using, in a kind of mechanical way, this proja, this design, this comb, and, loading it with ochre and just rolling it across the canvas. And this work references, some of the designs that are painted onto people's bodies, and, at this ceremony. And at this ceremony, it's believed that if you don't disguise yourself, then your body can become inhabited by, the spirit of the deceased. So, you cover your entire body and face with some of these designs. And this work also references some of the scarification that people put on their bodies. So another community that uses ochres is the Warman community, which is in the Kimberleys, which is a huge area in the kind of top. It's about the size of California, the top quadrant of Western Australia. And in the 1970s, early 80s, there were these boards that were painted and decorated with ancestral stories, and they would kind of be performed for large groups of people. And so, I'm looking at two communities, the Tiwi Islands and Warman, who exclusively use ochres, but also have transformed their practice from the very performative to, these kind of material examples of culture. This is a work by Lena Nyadby, and up the top, the vertical marks are referencing also the scarification. And I was really interested in, the scars as this kind of example of not just the wound, but also the kind of repair. And in lots of the works in this section, there was lots of references to kind of grief and melancholy, but also kind of, the body kind of trying to come to terms with some of these histories. And, this work by Paddy Bedford talks about an event that happened in the 1920s in Australia. So the members of the artist family were poisoned by a kind of a landowner in retaliation for the killing of a bullock. And this painting is interesting on a number of levels because it's referencing the ancestral creation of the land with this emu who became kind of a part of the landscape. She was walking through the desert, walking through the landscape, and then she got trapped in this cleft in the kind of face of this cliff. And you can see in this kind of bisecting band, this is the kind of the cleft, the opening in the cliff face. And so she's associated with death, but also this site became even more associated with death through this, the killing of the artist family. And so it's this interesting, collapse of ancestral history with modern history. And for Aboriginal people, this idea of the dreaming, the idea of, it's often termed the every when, this idea of kind of time folding back on itself. It's an interesting kind of way of looking at the world. This is another example by the artist talking about this period in frontier history in Australia in the 1920s, when there was a very kind of strong practice of apartheid, where Aboriginal people would live quite separately up the top from non-Aboriginal people, and they were linked, by this track, linked by quite asymmetrical terms of employment. This is a beautiful work. I don't know if anyone came to Howard Morpheus' lecture, but he spoke quite extensively about this work. And I just wanted to briefly talk about the shift from this very kind of figurative imagery, but you'll also notice the background design, the background imagery, which has always been, the most important part of the painting. And now this almost kind of complete kind of kind of recession of all of this figurative imagery. You'll notice in this work we have the depiction of this snake called mundo, and for most of the year he is seen as this shifting sandbar. And then at certain times of the year, as the kind of wet season comes, he raises himself up and spits the lightning, spits the thunder into the air, and kind of creates, the monsoon season. And so you can see, this referencing, the kind of coming down of the rain, but also, as the wet season approaches, all the kind of brackish water from the inland rivers and mangroves and billabongs kind of get pushed out into the sea. And so it's this kind of metaphor about the mixing of the fresh water with the salt water. This is a work from Western Arnhem Land, so slightly different to the work we've just seen, and it depicts this secular scene of a hunter with some of his kind of catch. You have the kangaroo and the two barramundi, that's the kind of fish. And this is an area that is very strongly associated with this stylistic convention of X-ray art. So you can see the internal organs of the animal. And this is kind of an analogy of how Indigenous people organise systems of knowledge. There is kind of inside knowledge and outside knowledge. And he's using this, beautiful kind of artist, using the kind of cross-hatching, these really very thin lines that, painted just with, a brush, from kind of your own head. And this is an artist from a Guningu artist, Peter Marawanga, one of the great Bart painters. And it's a kind of an odd painting. I like how he's kind of used every kind of available inch of the bark, and with the kind of the sweep of the tail, gives the work this great dynamism. And he really was instrumental in teaching a whole new generation of artists from Arnhem Land. And so his daughter, he really encouraged his daughter Cailin Turanga to create barks, and she was the first female painter to create works on bark and take them to the Maningrida Art Centre. And I like how she's kind of contesting Mayall kind of domain, but she's also painted a manjabu, this conical fish trap, which are mostly only created by men. So on two levels, she's kind of contesting male dominance. She was very encouraged to paint by her artist husband, John Mayall, who's really, one of the most important contemporary artists in Australia working today. And he has transcended this kind of, Aboriginal artist category, through the strength of his imagery. And he's, now routinely included in contemporary survey exhibitions. And, when you go up close, sometimes you'll think that the work is like a textile or a silk. It's so fine, so delicate. But, the work is a bark. And so it's stripped off the eucalyptus tree during the wet season, when it's much easier to take off and it doesn't split, and then flattened and dried. But the work still has this organic memory. Sometimes it's still wanting to curl back to being a bark. I think I've actually would like to stop there, and if we have any questions, I'll be upstairs, and I invite you to come upstairs and take a look at some of these works for yourself. So thank you very much for listening today.